Okay, so this is Wendy Brown and the Critique of Neoliberalism. This is kind of an interesting departure than what I've done the rest of the semester, which has been pretty um, strictly theorists that have been either sociologists, anthropologists, or heavily used by either. Whereas Wendy Brown is, at least to my knowledge, not widely read in either of those disciplines. She's a political scientist. She works in political critical theory. So she is a social theorist, and I think that her analysis of the social world and of the political world follow fairly in line with Foucault's. Um, so I think it fits, but in terms of her placement, it's kind of a little weird. So we're going to talk. The reason why I included neoliberalism is we often think of neoliberalism as simply an economic policy, one that is, just an idea of how economics can work, rather than a social theory of the way the world is and how it should be. And Wendy Brown provides us an analysis that, at its base, neoliberalism is a social theory that has had massive ramifications for how the world works, including economics, but also politics. I think her analysis it's difficult, especially that last chapter, because she's pulling in from a lot of different philosophers and political theorists. But it's very important in how we understand the current moment and to see it how uh, uh, a social theory can take over the world. This is almost, neoliberalism is one of the most wide-ranging social theories that I think have ever existed. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone to check their emails. Student evaluations are coming up. When I upload this PowerPoint, you can simply, use your phone, scan the QR code to take this student evaluation. Uh, I I can't implore you enough to take them because they are, for better or worse, very important for faculty's advancement, for faculty's, understanding of how to improve the course. And I would really like to hear from you on what went well in the course, what you thought about the course, and what could be better for next time. So please take them seriously. Please be honest and open. Everything is anonymous. I can't see who took the scores. I can't even see the scores until after the course has closed. So, and I've given you grades. So there's no way for me to be retributive if you hated it. If you hated it, that's okay. But I also wish you'd come and tell me that so that, I can make things better throughout the course. But we're nearing the end, so it doesn't matter as much now. But please come and talk to me either way. I love to hear your feedback on what could be improved or what went well, so that I know how to do it for future classes. But let's return to Wendy Brown. So Wendy Brown, she is a PhD. She's a doctorate in political science from Princeton. She's been working at UC Berkeley in the Institute for Advanced Study. She builds a lot from Foucault, Nietzsche, Marx. You'll see some words from Bourdieu in there, as well as Max Weber. So she pulls in a lot of what we've talked about in this class, which should help in reading, even though it's still fairly difficult. She is a scholar activist, as you can read throughout this piece. She definitely has a political orientation in the way she thinks the world should be. So she shows a path for many of you, which I've talked to, who really do want to be active in building a better society. She shows one way of, analyzing the current societal functions through a scholarly lens, but also providing a moral analysis for how it should be or for how to make things better. So, because she's a political scientist, you'll see a lot of her concerns are in how democracy functions. She takes democracy as a fundamental good, and a bunch of her critique on neoliberalism is its effect on democracy itself. Um, so that's just a little about Wendy Brown. To give a little background as well, she is talking about neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is an idea that it has a weird history. Neo, when you see the word neo, that means new or reborn. And so when we're talking about neoliberalism, the writers of neoliberalism are understanding themselves as a return to classic liberalism. Classic liberalism is often what we think of in terms of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment period, with thinkers celebrating freedom of individuality, of reason. And so one of the ways that the writers that we're going to talk about today, that Brown talks about, are seeing themselves as a return to this golden age of reason and enlightenment. Neoliberalism as a political and economic theory started with the Mount Pelerin Society. This was in the mid-1900s and largely is building off the work of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was responding to a competing economist at the time named, I forgot his, Francis Keynes, who was a British economist. And it's important to understand real quick what Keynesianism was and why Hayek was arguing against it. Keynesianism is an economic theory that argues that the state, as in the government, needs to intervene in the market to make sure that it has equal outcomes. So it needs to intervene in the market to curb unemployment. It needs to intervene in the market to help those in poverty and redistribute wealth. It needs to intervene in the market to help provide social goods like welfare, like education, like healthcare. And so Keynesian economics is what we often think of, like the best example of Keynesian policy for economics is the New Deal. So back in the 1930s, FDR, realizing that we had this Great Depression, instituted a wide variety of social programs to help people in poverty and to regulate the market so it wasn't permitting such extreme dangerous effects to the population. So we had Social Security at the time came around then, Medicare, lots of government-funded employment during that time. And so that's kind of Keynesian economics, is the idea that the market is not perfect, it's not going to help everyone, and so the government should intervene to make sure that everyone is taken care of. Now, in the 70s, so Friedrich Hayek has been against that from the very beginning. But in the 60s and 70s, there was massive political unrest, massive economic turmoil, both because of and apart from ways in which economies were being regulated. And so neoliberalism at that time kind of said, see, we told you government intervention is wrong. Here's a better path forward. So Hayek is one of the earliest writers of that time to be able to give a voice to this idea. Perhaps the most influential person after him is Milton Friedman, who was a U.S. economist, largely out of the University of Chicago, and who really, I can't stress enough about how much Milton Friedman has changed the world. I am going to upload my own version of the final project, which I'm doing it on Milton Friedman, because I think it's important to see how he specifically was able to use neoliberalism and enforce change around the world. But politically, the two politicians most in line with this are Ronald Reagan, the president of the US in the 80s, as well as Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister of England at the same time. You might hear Reaganomics or Thatcherism or Thatchonomics. Those are references to the ways in which Reagan and Thatcher built off of Friedman and Hayek's philosophies of economics and politics and really drastically changed both the political and economic landscapes of the US and the UK and the world beyond. So that's kind of a background of where neoliberalism as an idea is coming from. Next, we're going to really dive into what it is. So, first, you have to know that it's a really highly contested term. As I was going through, I was trying to find like a good video that, broke down the elements of neoliberalism and really defined it in simple terms, and every single one either got it wrong or only explained part of it. And so it's a pretty highly contested term, and today it's often used in the politics on the left, meaning, more liberal politics, as anything that they don't like economically, right? They'll call any economic policy that they do not trust or think is wrong as this is neoliberal. A lot of theorists have argued that's because neoliberalism isn't an ideology, it's just a buzzword. But recently, a lot of scholars like Wendy Brown have argued that no, this is a definite train of thought. This is a definite, body of theory that we need to understand and that has a basis. So it's often understood in the political realm as an ideology that the market, meaning economics, is the best mechanism for coordinating human action, the prices of goods, and the distribution of goods. And specifically, when people talk about the market this way, they mean Adam Smith's invisible hand market. The idea that if you put buyers and sellers and leave them to their own devices, then they will find out the best price for things, that they will come together and figure out how to interact with each other, and that they will find the best ways to distribute goods. And so with this kind of ideology, they tie neoliberalism to actions like deregulating the economy, getting the government out. When you hear the term small government, that's what they're talking about. Privatization of all public sectors. So this is another big move that was largely Reaganomics. So going in and saying, we aren't going to do welfare, we're going to have private companies do welfare. We see this with prisons today, that a large amount of them are becoming privatized and being run by private companies. That's an example of the privatization of a public sector. And there's also this explicit acceptance of inequality. So that inequality is necessary to encourage people to work harder, to, incentivize, innovation and hard work. Otherwise, people who accept the tenets of neoliberalism will say that if we don't have inequality, then there's no reason to work, there's no reason to innovate, and there's no reason to do better. Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy argues that there are three key elements to the idea of neoliberalism. Those are that there's a liberal capitalism, and by liberal capitalism, we're really focusing on this idea that the market economy is best for, organizing human action, and that human action is individual and should be private, right? That it shouldn't be groups of people, it shouldn't be public, but it should be individual people owning private property and buying and selling goods on the market. Second, that there should be a minimal welfare state, that the government should not be as involved in providing social services, and that the democracy is good, but with limits. This Stanford Encyclopedia says that Hayek's case for democracy tends to be instrumentalist, as he's arguing that the true value of democracy is only to serve as a sanitary precaution against an abuse of power. So essentially, it provides a means for us to get rid of a government in favor of a new government. That's what democracy does. In practice, we see that a lot of neoliberal scholars and politicians and economists like Milton Friedman actually do not mind much who is doing it, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, as long as the free market is being allowed. So if you are interested, you can look up Milton Friedman's interventions in Cuba, where he helped overthrow a democratically elected left-wing government that was not in favor of privatization, and they ousted him in favor of a dictatorship, which then enforced privatization. Okay, so Brown takes another approach. She argues that for neoliberals, so this is a neoliberal idea, society as a concept is detrimental to freedom and individuality and thus must be denounced. So she calls it the project of dismantling and disparaging the social state in the name of free, responsibilized individuals. And so this is an interesting take that she's saying that neoliberalism needs society not to exist as a concept, that there is no such thing as society. There is no such thing that, is greater than, and I think the way a lot of these neoliberals are thinking about it is they're contending against a Durkheimian idea of society, that there is a thing apart from individuals that guides our actions and influences our behaviors and beliefs. As an example to this idea of trying to denounce society as a concept, here's a quote from Margaret Thatcher, who said, too many people have been given to understand that if I have a problem, it's the government's job to cope with it, or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. So discounting the idea that there is a society, and it's interesting that she says that these people are casting their problems on society, but there is no society. So really, what are they casting their problems on? It's a little counterintuitive, but this is a famous quote where Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. Now, when neoliberalism is trying to dismantle or disparage the social state, that comes in a variety of forms. So Thatcher and Reagan highly pushed for privatization, where private companies would take over public services. Bush, Clinton, and even today, there's a move for public-private partnerships, where private companies will run social services with grants from the government. So a lot of homeless services today operate this way, where they are nonprofits or other private companies that receive grants for the government to run homeless services. Many in this area are in favor of outright elimination of welfare, and that everything should be, run by the market, or that we should deconstruct or eliminate the administrative state, so the bureaucracy of the government. So those are a variety of ways in which neoliberalism is seeking to dismantle the social state. Are there any questions on that point or what we've covered so far? Okay. As always, feel free to speak up, raise your hand, put it in the chat. So if there's no society, what is it? What do we make of why humans interact with each other, how they interact with each other? What is it that keeps us connected if it's not a society as Durkheim would imagine it? Neoliberalism focuses on markets and morals, and this is kind of how they describe it. So it's a complex interdependence does not arise from a fellow feeling or an organized common pursuit. So you can think of, he's saying that the way in which we work together is not because of some solidarity like Durkheim would argue, but from individuals following rules of conduct that emanate from markets and moral traditions. So that we follow rules because of the ways that markets have arisen and religious morals. Specifically, he goes on that what we're calling society is simply a structure formed by millions and millions and millions of different chains of trade. So all of the people who are connected are only connected because of trade and the markets. Further, if one of the reasons why Hayek was so scared of society was if there is a society that organizes humans, that can affect humans, then it would be open to be manipulated or mobilized. And that is the basis of totalitarianism, the idea that one person can come in and kind of direct the life outcomes of an entire group of people. That is what Hayek would argue is totalitarianism. So here is a quote from Hayek. It's quoted in brown. I have the page number here. The more dependent the position of the individuals or groups is seen to become on the actions of government, the more that they will insist that the governments aim at some recognizable scheme of distributive justice. So that the government should redistribute wealth or resources in some way. And the more governments try to realize some preconceived pattern of desirable distribution, the more that they must subject the position of the different individuals and groups to their control. So long as the belief in social justice governs political action, this process must progressively approach nearer and nearer to a totalitarian system. So he's saying, if we are pushing a state to intervene in the market, to redistribute wealth, to address social injustices, then what will happen is that the government will intercede on individual liberties, and that is totalitarianism. Are there any questions on how Hayek sees the belief that that government should take care of each other as totalitarian?
No.
Okay. So what are markets and morals then, and why are these the foundation for social life? Markets and morals, according to Hayek, arise spontaneously. So they're things that are independent of human intentions, and they establish rules of conduct that are separate from state coercion. So it's interesting to note here that Hayek is seeing I just lost the thought. That is terrible. He is seeing that state coercion is itself not necessarily a human or a social construct, also arising spontaneously out of repeated negotiations between individuals. He sees it as an institution that is dangerous to individuality, whereas most sociologists are looking at the state as a social creation itself. The state is is an institution which we agree to follow. It is an institution which, if tomorrow we all decided that the US government has no control and we all stop paying taxes and we all stop following the laws, the US government would essentially cease to exist, right? And that is a difference of how Hayek is understanding the idea of the state, because by thinking that rules of conduct coming from state coercion is not spontaneous, rather than something like the marketplace or morality or religion. So he argues that markets and moralities reveal a truer nature of justice than what social justice is. So he understands social justice more as the redistribution of resources in the forms of outcomes, that everyone should have the same outcomes. Or if there is an inequality in wealth, then that is bad, and we need to redistribute the wealth. He argues that both markets and morals, what they are concerned about is conduct rather than outcomes. They legislate or they rule on the issue of how you go about your life, how you go about trade, rather than if there is an unfair outcome of trade. And so this would mean that markets and morals are looking at the process rather than the result. And Brown writes that now we are in the position to understand what Hayek considers so dangerous about social justice and those who follow it, that would remake the world according to a rational plan or grand moral calculus. They draw on a fatal conceit of society and the wrong-headed principle of equality to attack the twin pillars of civilization, traditional morality and competitive markets. They are spirited by a form of social and intellectual primitivism that imagines a director behind all self-ordering processes and lacks the maturity to fathom historical evolution and social and cooperation that exceed intentional design. So that he's saying markets and morals already establish rules of conduct that are just because they focus on conduct rather than outcomes. And that any attempt to regulate that outside of markets and morals instead views it's like a dictator coming in and deciding what is best rather than this organic institution like the market or like religion that otherwise guides social life. Questions?
I don't have a question, but like I don't know why this sort of reminds me of functionalism for some reason. Am I stretching saying that?
Uh, can you reason through why you're thinking that?
I mean, I feel like when they hear about the theory of functionalism, it's basically like it was explained to me this way that basically, everyone has like the ability to get, I don't know. I can't even
Yeah.
explain it
No, that's
correctly.
fine. Um,
Like, yeah, like
I
base.
oh, go ahead. You
Sorry.
go.
Like basically, like everyone has pretty much the same. Joy, I'm on the phone, baby girl. Like basically, like everyone has the same desired outcome. I don't know. It just sounds familiar to me. Like everyone um has all these like opportunities, and I don't know. I just it just reminds me of it for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So, I am probably not the best person to ask because functionalism, at least as a social theory, has kind of fallen away since the 1970s. Um, so that are people who built upon Durkheim, like Parsons, was probably the most famous functionalist. And I don't know too much about functionalism itself because it is not used as much anymore. Um, the way, your average sociological textbook would think about functionalism is that um, social norms and laws and organizations evolve in order to keep a society functioning. And so,
So it's completely the opposite.
so that's just what I understand about it. There may very well be functionalists who talk about it in the way you described it, um, but I just am not familiar enough because that's just not been my area.
No, no worries. I may be wrong. I mean, I feel like I've been like loaded with different theories, but it just
No,
some of the
that's
things that were said,
That's
you
very
know.
true. That I have, thrown a lot at you all this semester, as well as other classes. I think what's interesting in this is the idea that markets and morals for neoliberals arise spontaneously, um, yet a lot of the sociologists we've discussed have explained how. So, um, Bourdieu, for example, has discussed, we talked about how he argues that each field of, or each social sphere creates norms and morals and rules and organizations based on human interactions that repeat, different, they create repetitive action that become institutionalized and we embody them. And so the idea that markets and morals arise spontaneously has been explained by sociologists. And that Durkheim himself talks about how that morality is something that arises through collective, emotions and collective gathering and collective energies. So um, it's interesting that to me that the basis for Hayek's argument that we are individually, that we are beings together independent, um, is he describes the reason that is the same way that sociologists describe the reason there is a society that we should study. Um, and I'm not yet sure how to grapple with the fact that they both talk about it in the same way, but attribute it to different outcomes. But that's how I connect it to other theorists in the past. I haven't thought much about functionalism. Any other questions? Okay. So one of the things that Hayek or that Brown looks at is how have people, especially those under the neoliberal label, worked to get rid of society, specifically the societal notion. We saw how Thatcher just flatly denied its existence. Romney and similar people on the right will call any attempts for social justice as politics of envy. We saw how Reagan sought to dismantle or privatize the social state. There has been a political notion that the liberty is distinct from equality. Social justice disrupts traditional values. Demassification, which is dividing up the working class into units so that the working class can't be seen as an economic class. And then I think one of the interesting things that Brown traces is this kind of three-step equation. First, that neoliberals see any kind of coercion as unfreedom. So if you force the wealthy to pay taxes, that is fundamentally unfree, right? Because you are coercing them to do something. They then argue that equality is only accessible via coercion, right? We can only achieve equality if you force wealthy people or people who are different to conform or to give up their wealth in some way. And thus, any form of equality is fundamentally unfree. And so when you have a left-wing politics saying we are pushing for equality, we want, better minimum wage laws, we want more just incarceration laws or criminal justice systems, then the way that neoliberals can respond to that is coercing other people to do things, thus you are not advocating for freedom. And what does this have to do with democracy? So this is how Brown opens up her book, is a discussion on democracy. And she argues that political equality is fundamentally necessary for democracy to happen. So whereas neoliberals are arguing that equality disrupts freedom, Brown is arguing that equality is necessary for democracy. And she quotes from Rousseau, who is one of the founders of the Enlightenment, that differences in power among democratic people must, quote, not be so great that they can be wielded as violence, and also that none may, quote, be so rich that he can buy another, and none so poor that he is compelled to sell himself. So this is the idea that if there are immense inequalities of power or of wealth, then democracy is unreachable because rich people will either be able to buy positions or powerful people will be able to coerce their positions. So she concludes this section on page 26 by saying, an orientation towards democracy requires state support for public goods ranging from healthcare to quality education, economic redistributions, and strong prophylaxis against corruption by wealth. Neither markets themselves nor winners within them can be permitted to rule if democracy is to prevail. Both must be contained in the interest of political equality, democracy's foundation. So if we ignored public goods, if we allowed markets to rule, or if we allowed the winners of markets to rule, remember, markets, according to neoliberals, are inherently unequal, then we would have political inequality. Wealthy or powerful people could better dictate the state, and thus democracy would no longer be functioning. It would be something like an oligarchy or a plutocracy or a fascist, you know. So we're looking at fundamentally different ideas of what it means to have a democracy. That for neoliberalism, the idea is that freedom is the core essence of a democracy, that any kind of coercion is negative, whereas Brown is arguing no, political equality is necessary for everyone to have an equal voice and equal say and equal knowledge of the voting options. Any questions so far? Okay, so as I reread chapter 5, I could imagine people saying, what on earth is happening in this chapter? Because it is very theoretical, especially at the beginning. She's pulling in from so many different theorists and talking about these like kind of psychological, philosophical ideas like nihilism and I can never say this right, ressentiment, but you can just say resentment. It's a French word. So what on earth was this chapter about? And I recognize it was difficult, so if you were struggling, you can just stop and watch this lecture. So think Foucault at the very beginning as we talk about power. She starts pulling from Nietzsche, Schmidt, and some other folks to conclude that power is radically human, that it derives neither from nature nor from God, and thus it is an end to the dialectic of power and powerlessness. So we can no longer say that God is powerful and humans are not powerful, or that nature or that deities or that, you know, other things have power. Instead, human power comes from humans. And with modernity, it loses its human face, right? We no longer have kings, we no longer have barons, we no longer have militias. We have what is called a democracy, which makes it seem that everyone is involved in power, but this makes power diffuse and has multiplied its effects. So another way to think about when we say power doesn't come from God, how does it have anything to do with kings? Most of kingships in the history of mankind claimed divine power, right? European kings claimed that a Christian God endowed them with the right to rule. Many other kings throughout the world claimed some form of deity was protecting that king or queen. But now with modernity, we accept that no political leader is imbued with that religious right, that it is instead a democratic process. She argues that power has become a multiplying, intensifying force without respect for its creators, and it exceeds the will to power from any institution or individual. No one person can wield modern power. It is beyond our control. And it is hidden. We can't easily identify where it is, right? Like we can't say, oh, this is power, or this is happening because of this, or this institution wields power in this way, because there is such a broad system of different individuals and institutions wielding power that it is everywhere and multiplying and no longer can be traced back to its source. This is very similar to Foucault's idea of power, that it is in every interaction, power exists in the attempt to assert one's ideal or one's position. And she says the consequence of this is that because we are detracting power from God or nature, it erodes any foundation for values. We no longer have those values inherent in institutions, and those beliefs no longer have restraint or self-blame, or can no longer, the values themselves can no longer stick because they have been, detached from those things that held it key. And this is similar to Max Weber's argument about the iron cage. Remember, he argued that capitalism, and initially in the West, was created because Protestants were trying to prove themselves to God, prove that they were, the elect and that they were saved. But eventually they lost that moral reasoning for engaging in capitalism, and thus capitalism became an iron cage. They weren't able to throw it off because they no longer had the reasoning for why they were engaging in it in the first place, and they just kind of got stuck in that capitalism. So she's arguing that when we've detached power from, or when we've detached values from God or nature, then we no longer have the reason or the bedrock to exercise restraint, to live those values. So she is she's pulling a lot from Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a philosopher in the late 1800s, early 1900s, just before Weber, a little bit at the same time, and he argues throughout his works about this idea of resentment, that it's experiencing suffering, especially perceived as unjust, and seeking to blame or punish the source of that suffering. So I might, when I stub my toe, I might, on the table, I might like pound the table and yell at it for a second because I'm like, I don't deserve to have my toe stubbed. And the only thing that really could explain that is this table. So I'm going to pound on the table to like give it its comeuppance. We do this in a lot of sorts of ways, right? We might see it in the suffering that one experiences with a loved one who has cancer, trying to find blame. Well, is it the pharmaceutical companies for not giving us this treatment? Is it God for allowing my friend or my family member to die? Is it the doctors for not doing good enough? Is it me for not taking care of her, right? We look to place blame or find the source of the suffering and then somehow punish it. This is resentment. Nietzsche, just as a quick aside, argues that this is a very weak way to live. He's definitely putting a moral twist on this, and he says that we should be looking to better ourselves, not because of resentment of suffering, but out of a excitement for a future self. So rather than living the world angry at suffering, we should be looking for excitement for what could come or what changes might happen. So that's where Nietzsche's coming from. Brown is focusing on resentment and tying it to this nihilism that because we have no ability to find the power, because we have no source, we can't like back in the 1700s, if the King of England imprisoned my partner for not paying his taxes and then cut his head off, it's clear that the King of England is at fault, and I can raise my pitchfork against the King of England. Whereas today, if I am fined for not paying taxes, who do I go to? Do I go to the IRS? Well, they're just doing their job. Do I go to the Congress? Well, they didn't enact the laws. It was enacted before them. Do I go to my accountant for following the taxes wrong? Probably not, because he probably did it right. So who do I go to complain about taxes? The power has been so dispersed that it's harder for me to find the source of the suffering, and thus it increases the rage, it increases the concerns, and so Wendy Brown is connecting this idea that power has become so amorphous and invisible that more and more people are increasing their resentment. They're experiencing suffering. They can't feel or understand why. They feel it's unjust, and they want to place blame on something. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. So, how does Brown tie all this back in? What's the point of talking about these weird concepts? Step one. So, nihilism, this divorcing the values from their foundations of either God or nature, and this dispersion of power thrusts us into a tribalism. This, like, we are, I'm only going to, like, care about those who are right next to me, look like me, and think like me, right? So she says this tribalism is a broken relation to the world demographically outside and temporally after one's own. So I'm not going to care about future generations. I'm not going to care about other people. Why should I? Right? There's no point to any of this. I'm just going to take care of my own. Step two, when you connect nihilism or nihilism, or however you pronounce it, and neoliberalism's idea that freedom means lack of coercion, right? So any kind of coercion means you're taking away my freedom. This leads to a radical depression of conscious and social obligation. It leads people to stop caring about others, especially those outside of their tribe, and an indifference to predicaments of or fate to other humans, species, or the planet, right? So if I'm thinking of neoliberalism that is focused on my individual needs, my individual morals, and my my individual work with the market, I shouldn't be concerned about others, and I shouldn't be concerned about the future, because if I engage in the market, then that's what's good, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. That's the neoliberal view. That's how I should function. And she argues, Brown, that this results in a really paradoxical politic where freedom is torn out of the habitus of traditional values. So notice the Bourdieu term here. Freedom is torn out of the habitus and traditional values by which it was to be contained and disciplined. And this generates a disinhibited freedom, one symptomizing ethical destitution, meaning there's no more ethics, even though it dresses these in religious righteousness or conservative melancholy for a phantasmic past. So she's saying that I lack any ethical norms to care for my people or to love one another or whatever the religious idea is, even though I claim that I want to return to a religious past, that I want to be more Christ-like or more, communal. So this freedom is paradoxically expressed as nihilism against nihilism, attacking and destroying while faulting its objects of derision for the ruin of traditional values and order. This reminded me of if you follow memes at all, it reminded me, there's a specific meme where a guy is looking back and shooting someone in a chair, and then he turns back and asks, why has someone else done this? I think it's called the gunshot meme. You can look it up. But it reminds me of like what her argument is neoliberals shooting morality and then looking at the camera and saying, why have liberals killed morality? Is kind of what she's saying. Is that this neoliberalism, which focuses so much on individuality and market interaction, has distanced itself from the purpose of morality, and thus has eroded morality itself, while blaming people fighting for social justice as being immoral. Does that make sense? Did I connect those, or is there still confusion?
It makes a lot of sense. It sounds a lot like class privilege to me.
I can't disagree, but we'll see on the next page. I think if we bring this back to Du Bois, I think this can be seen as an intentional philosophical idea to eliminate low-class progress or social movements, right? If we're able to stir up certain conglomerates of working class people to think that any fight for justice is immoral, then we've separated working class groups, and the people in power will no longer be, you know, at risk because they're divided amongst themselves and they can't form a coalition to actively and meaningfully push for change. So let's get to that connection. And I think this is really helpful if we think about this. So we've talked about resentment, we've talked about capitalism and neoliberalism. Let's, in this kind of end of Brown's work, she really connects it to different axes of power. And so I think it's helpful if we think matrix of domination here, while she brings in these different axes of power like race, gender, sexuality, etc. So resentment, rancor, rage, reaction to humiliation and suffering, certainly all of these are at play in right-wing populism and support for authoritarian leadership today. However, this politics of resentment emerges from the historically dominant, meaning those in historically privileged positions, as they feel that dominance failing, falling away, as whiteness especially, but also masculinity. So she's bringing in race and class, or race and gender here. Masculinity provided limited protection against the displacements and losses that 40 years of neoliberalism have yielded for the working middle classes. She is not saying this, but if you look back since neoliberalism became a dominant political ideology, the separation between the wealthy and the lower classes has increased substantially. And the middle class is very small and not as vibrant as it used to be. So there's very few, but incredibly wealthy, like so wealthy, no period in the history of the world has ever conceived of this. A very small, super wealthy portion of the world, and then this massive poor portion of the world. And so she's saying that whiteness and masculinity no longer provide much protection against those losses that neoliberalism has brought. And though linked by humiliation, the frustrations of weakness, whether existential or historical, and of aggrieved power are worlds apart, obvious enough in the radically different responses by working class whites and working class blacks to the displacements and demotions delivered by neoliberal economic effects. Only the former is aggrieved by its dethronement. So she's saying that working class blacks have often recognized, you know, the power imbalance that they feel. They haven't had this, what's the word, racialized and gendered privilege like working class whites. And so when working class whites even lose that, they feel this resentment even more, and they have no place to put it, whereas working blacks don't see or experience that same kind of resentment. And the way that we've done politics pushes working class whites to blame not the neoliberal movement that has yielded this problem, but, you know, immigrants, blacks, liberals, transgenders, you know, and they can, you know, they just list off anyone who is different, trying to find the blame for that suffering, because the way neoliberalism has diffused power throughout all these economic and political systems. We can't identify that easily to say, this is the problem, let's fix it. For example, if I say, if you had a magic wand and can make one change in economic policy to make the world a better place, what would you do? It's hard to find one thing that would make a drastic change, right? We could say, oh, let's increase the minimum wage, but inflation will still go up. Right? And so that eventually will become obsolete again. We could say maybe provide everyone with decent housing, but something else could come and become more expensive and become the, you know, rare or expensive need that differentiates people. So it's hard to find that one economic thing that would just solve the world. And so it's hard for people to find their or place the blame of their suffering on this, economic system. And instead, it's much easier to just blame a demographic group of people. To finish off, she writes, the white male supremacism in contemporary traditional values politics becomes explicit not only because nihilism pulls the moral drapery off those values and makes them contractual or instrumentizable. So let's parse out this sentence. So if we think back to the 1930s or even to slavery, a lot of slavery and racism was justified using religion or some kind of morality, right? Um, God made us different, or God wanted white people to be in charge. I don't know what the justification was, but they often used religion or some kind of moral judgment to justify that racism. But when you take away that religion, then you see that there is no basis for supremacism and it's only used instrumentally, right? White supremacy is only used to better those who are using it. It's not used because of God. It's not right. So it's very clear and open, and I don't know how to explain it, and becomes obvious rather than a moral judgment. And then it says, and then this supremacism has been wounded without being destroyed. Its subject abhors the democracy it holds responsible for its wounds and seeks to pull democracy down as it goes down. I think this was written before the 2000 or 2020 January 6th, or is that 2021? The 2021 January 6th, debacle where people stormed the Capitol, this idea that the election has been stolen. So this was even written before that, but the idea that we should tear it all down because it is hurting us. It's taking away our privilege. It's taking away these white supremacist or gender supremacist or otherwise privileged values we've had, even though that's not what necessarily they're losing. What they're losing is the access to wealth that neoliberalism has divided between the rich and the poor. That was a lot, and I know that was a lot. And I understand if you need to sit back and take this, but I'm interested if people have any thoughts or questions based on what we just covered.
I don't. It's just like you said,
It's a lot.
it's a lot to take in. I do think that the first paragraph does remind me a lot of Du Bois,
Hmm.
in her argument. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I
it's a
and
lot.
I can see that a lot, and it's personally, if I could get, I'm taking off academic professor level and I'm putting on, politically engaged Eric. Um, I can see a lot of this happening um, within the last year, or within the last 2 years. If we think about COVID has decimated both um, working class, white, black, and Latino communities. So many of these communities have been just absolutely demolished by COVID. Um, and yet, the wealthiest groups, organizations, and people in society have only grown richer. Um, and the politics today are not geared towards that. They're geared towards, race, critical race theory. They're geared towards transgender politics, right? We have Florida as a state going against Disney because of one transgender student. And so this is it's kind of like we're living in the Twilight Zone a little bit, that we are fighting the wrong wars, and I find it a masterclass of the economic elite to divide us in that way rather than who cares? let's make sure everyone has the food they need on the table, right? So that's how I'm reading this in terms of politically interested, Eric, and now I'll put back on theorist um, professor level so I can respond to other questions as an academic rather than as a politically engaged citizen.
Well, that was good.
I do think that we could, and this is not me like justifying or um, giving a pass to anyone who engages in disgusting, rhetoric or politics, but I do think um, I personally could engage more charitably to understand that a lot of the political fights we're having today have been constructed by those in power and aren't the actual values that people hold. Um, there is my work in LGBT sectors has shown that even in religious centers that have doctrine that is very, we'll say not pro LGBT, um, in practice, on the majority of them do not care. And that if you are in need, they're going to help you if you're in need, right? And I've seen this in many families, and there's always a disturbing amount of people and too many people who do, cast out those who are LGBT. But I feel like even the majority of conservatives, when they're faced with someone in that situation, are going to reach out and help them. Um, and so it is unclear to me why this has to be a political fight when there are so many more political fights that could, address more and more people and help more and more people than fighting over for trans kids. There's if you don't mind me going on my soapbox a little bit, I'm going to pull up a statement from Governor of Utah. There's I'm going to see if I can find something that's not behind a paywall. Um, that one's behind a paywall. Okay, let me switch the screen share. Oh, for the love. That one's on a paywall too. So this is the kind of um, politics that I think is interesting. So in Utah, the legislature made a bill that would um, prohibit transgender sports, and it would allow people to sue the school district if there were transgender sports. Um, he wrote um, transgender sports, and he's a conservative, he's a Republican. Transgender sports participation issue is one of the most divisive of our time because there are logical and passionate arguments by many parties. Finding compromise or common ground can be difficult. As you know, the negotiations centered around the potential compromise of a commission of experts that would help decide on an individual basis which kids would be able to participate in sports. The concept was fairly simple. Unfortunately, over time, negotiations got bogged down. Where was it? Mm-hmm. No, 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 no. Okay. Um, there are a few problems. First, the bill would do nothing to prevent, issues of um, injustice in sports. And there's a broad misunderstanding of the rules. And this one. Finally, there is one more important reason for this veto. I must admit, I'm not an expert on transgenderism. I struggle to understand so much of it, and the science is conflicting. When in doubt, however, I always try to err on the side of kindness, mercy, and compassion. I also try to get proximate, and I'm learning so much for our transgender community. There are great kids who face enormous struggles. Here are the numbers that have most impacted my decisions. 75,000 high school kids participating in high school sports, 4 transgender kids playing high school sports in Utah, 1 transgender student playing girls' sports, 86% of trans youth reporting suicidality, 56% of trans youth having attempted suicide. 4 kids and only one of them playing girls' sports. This is what it is all about. 4 kids who aren't dominating or winning trophies or taking scholarships. 4 kids who are just trying to find some friends and feel like they are a part of something. 4 kids trying to get through each day. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. I don't understand what they are going through or why they feel the way they do, but I want them to live. And all the research shows that even a little acceptance and connection can reduce suicidality significantly. Um, and he says, I understand that you are probably going to veto this, but if a veto override occurs, I hope we can work to find ways to show these 4 kids that we love them and they have a place in our state. Right? So I felt that that was a reasonable like approach to this that tried to um uh I don't know what the word is, like advance above the absurdities of politics today rather than like focusing on whether or not someone wins or loses a political argument, but looking at what are the actual human costs in the political decisions we make and what does that have to do with, our next steps. Who is affected? And I think that's very important. And I thought that was one of the better responses to this debate that we've seen coming from the conservative side. But overall, I still think the issue is it's for people. Like why are we spending so much money fighting over 4 people when we could be making legislation that, improves the lives of millions? So again, that's little political Eric speaking. In any case, that was the end of the lecture, as well as this is the last class lecture, and I've appreciated everyone attending and giving their thoughts. I've loved having this class with you all. I'm sorry that things have been chaotic, that like some assignments haven't been posted as easily, or the reading guides might not have been up specifically on time, and I apologize for that. But I hope that we can give each other mutual grace on that. So if you are having any difficulties with assignments, or you felt in any way that life circumstances or my course management affected your ability to go forward, please let me know. We can work it out. And otherwise, this has been a great semester. Please feel free to meet with me before the end or after about this class or life or anything else. And what was I going to say? Oh, regarding like just class. So remember that your final projects are due by the 1st. It can simply be a presentation. I don't expect it to be perfect. What I'm looking for is your engagement with the material. So follow the outline, make a presentation, post it on the discussion board, and we'll just have a discussion. If you still need to do a choose your own theorist, that will be due at the last due date, which is May 8th, as well as any makeup work that is required, like the group sheets, the discussion board posts, and anything. So that's it from me. Do you have any lingering questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed this class. You know that
Thank
already.
you.
Um,
Well, I appreciate
you
it.
are great. I did fill out my evaluation form for you
Great.
as
Thank you.
soon as I got it.
Well, I
Um,
appreciate
and I
that.
know I asked you earlier about the presentation. So do you
Yeah.
want us to actually record ourselves doing the presentation and then okay,
Yeah.
and then we post it so then the students can respond to it.
hmm
Gotcha.
So if you're unsure of how to do like how to record yourself on a presentation, if you're using PowerPoint, let me end this show and I'll show you. Let's switch. For those who aren't familiar with PowerPoint, you can record it by going, um, under slideshow and record slideshow, you'll just want to make sure your PowerPoint is connected to your, your microphone. You don't need to have your video up. If you have the free account of WebEx or Zoom, you can also do recordings that way. And that's how I do my recordings, right? So I'm recording it right now, and it saves it to my computer, and that's another way to record it easily. You can also use Google Slides, which have a recording function as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? Great. Well, have a great end of semester, and please inundate me with emails if you have questions. I want to make sure that you have everything you need to finish up the semester great. Okay?
All right. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.